Thank you, Chairman Corker. And thank you for holding this hearing, and thank you for the skilled and insightful testimony we received from both witnesses so far. Well, here we are on the other side of implementation day. And as has been reviewed, Iran has taken several important, significant steps to delay their ability to quickly develop a nuclear weapons capability. And I am relieved by the long overdue release of 5 Americans from unjust Iranian custody and the steps the administration has taken to sanction individuals and entities that were involved in supporting Iran's ballistic missile program. But I am deeply concerned that where we are now is that Iran has tens of billions of dollars of additional resources, and that despite a lot of important efforts and a lot of valuable progress made through the JCPOA, I think our responsibility working together to deter Iran and contain Iran is more urgent and more difficult than ever before. So it is my hope that we will achieve the view that Mr. Katulis offered in the outset of a more coherent and more assertive approach in the region. I appreciate your recognizing the interdiction of a weapons shipment to the Houthis. In pressing the administration over and over for more information and more details about interdictions of weapons flow or funding flow, I am repeatedly told we can brief you on that in a classified setting. And I say that's very helpful. But it would be more helpful if our allies in the region and my constituents and our country were briefed on this in an open setting. And I understand the tension, but we need to show what we are actually doing. Saying is good, doing is better. I'm also interested in your views on how we can strengthen our regional allies and demonstrate that our policy is one of containment of Iran and that our attitude towards them remains one of suspicion. They remain a nuclear threat, because the knowledge of how to enrich uranium and produce a weapon is widely distributed amongst their technical and engineering staff, and we will have to stay on this for decades to come. So if I could first to both of you, many members of Congress, including my colleague Senator Menendez, have called for the swift renewal of the Iran Sanctions Act, which expires at the end of this calendar year. What's your opinion on the renewal of the ISA, and what do you think would be the views of our P5+1 partners, and what do you think its consequences would be? And then second, if you'd speak to the unfrozen revenues, the Iranian assets that have been held in banks around the world and are now going to be flowing back to them. How do you expect Iran to use these dollars? And are there mechanisms by which you believe we can track and report to the world their deposits in the Central Bank of Iran, their distribution into the Iranian system, and be more effective at interdicting cash flows to their terrorist proxies in the region? Mr. Singh?
Well, thank you, Senator Coons. On the renewal of the Iran Sanctions Act, I do think it's important to do. I think it's important that we be in a position to actually execute the snapback of sanctions if it comes to that. I do think that at this stage, the concern that our allies would have about doing it now that we're past implementation day is probably a lot less than would have been pre-implementation day. I think now it's unlikely that renewing the ISA would unravel the deal somehow. I do think, though, it's important, too, that we have other penalties in place to punish Iran short of full snapback, and that we also enforce the sanctions which are on the books, which you yourself have said, Senator. So I think that it's one element of what needs to be a broader sort of look at sanctions. And we also have to look at the ways that Iran is going to try to get around those existing sanctions, because I expect them to come up with new ways to circumvent sanctions as they have in the past. On the question of the unfrozen revenues, we've heard a lot about how Iran will or won't use the revenues. I think only Iran knows the answer to this question fully, and maybe only the Supreme Leader of Iran. But I'll tell you, my view is under President Rouhani, in his first budget, there was an increase in military and security spending. And I would expect that Iran's regional priorities are sufficiently important that it's going to use some of this money on regional priorities. We've seen a decline, for example, in the funding that Iran has given to Hezbollah in recent years. It wouldn't surprise me if that went back up. Wouldn't surprise me if some of this money went into defending the Assad regime or into Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And that's for two reasons. One is simply that these are important issues to Iran. They've shown that time and time again, when we would have thought it would be prudent for them to develop their own country, they've instead spent the money on a nuclear program or terrorist groups or things which don't benefit Iranians. And second, from a macroeconomic perspective, there's a reason that you wouldn't necessarily want to immediately repatriate $50 billion or whatever the exact figure is, because of the sort of inflationary or currency effects that might have. So I do expect they'll use some on things which we find very concerning. We do, I think, have tools at the Treasury Department to try to track these things, to try to interdict these things. But frankly, some of the removal of the sanctions on the banks and now the much more permissive environment will, I think, complicate that. It'll be a harder task. And we'll need to be quite sure that banks around the world understand that we're still determined to enforce the sanctions which are on the books and make sure they understand what those sanctions are. And so we'll need to be engaged in, I would say, as heavy an educational campaign, an enforcement campaign, as we were in, say, the 2007, 2008 period when sanctions were ramping up.
Thank you, Mr. Katolis.
Just really quickly, because I think Mike covered much of your questions, but the one question on the P5+1 partners and how they might respond to renewal of sanctions, this is where diplomacy comes in. I think our friends in the administration talk, I think, a very good game, and I think they're right about tough and hard diplomacy with adversaries. But we also need to talk to our partners and allies and those in Europe, Russia, and China. This, I think, what was a strong point of the Obama administration in the last 8 years was that we built an international coalition that exacted cost on the Iranian regime. We need to have those tools in place, as I think you've said many times and have written recently, that this is not done. You know, the implementation day is just one day in one moment, but Iranian behavior needs to be monitored closely, and not only monitored, but it has to be structured in such a way that they understand we have all of these tools at our disposal. On the unfrozen revenues, I think there's a lot of conjecture here. I mean, I think Mike nailed it, and I think our Treasury Department, some of our intelligence agencies may understand what's happening here, but there's so many different moving targets in terms of what the Iranian regime might or might not do. But let's be clear, even when it was under the harshest of sanctions, it was supporting some of the most malign actions and behaviors, supporting people who wanted to assassinate the Saudi ambassador in this town. So that's why I think we all need to be vigilant and have stronger tools. And these sorts of questions that I think have been raised already about, has our response been too tepid in reaction to Iranian provocations? These are the sorts of questions that I think we all in this country need to ask if we want this JCPOA to succeed in its objectives.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate both your testimony. If I had more time, I'd ask additional questions about the Kurds and how we support our Saudi allies. I've taken the initiative to meet with both British and French ambassadors recently, and to just reinforce my view that there are sanctions that remain on the books that we will enforce and that we intend to enforce, and to meet with banking leaders from Europe to convey that same point. I think that is a message worth repeating over and over and over, so we don't find ourselves at counter purposes with our P5+1 allies. And I agree strongly we need a graduated menu of responses. I expect Iranian cheating to be initially marginal and initially modest. And if they are not responded to promptly and effectively in a coordinated way with our allies, we will lose whatever advantage we may have gained through this agreement. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.